My name is Valerie Martinez. Today is April 14th, 2017, and I am with Mr. Mario Lewis for an interview for the Political and Civic Engagement portion of the Voces Oral History Project. Mr. Lewis, if you could, begin by telling me your full name, your birth date, and where you were born.
Mario Manuel Lewis. I was born on February 15th, 1947 in El Paso, Texas at Hotel du Hospital.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you again for being here and for allowing us this interview with you. So I want to start, back to your earliest memories. So you were born in El Paso. Is this where you grew up?
I grew up in El Paso. Didn't leave El Paso until I was about 21 years of age for the first time.
So how was it like growing up in El Paso?
Well, my earliest memory, literally, is about age 2.5. My parents had a rough period at that time, and as I later came to find out, there were rougher periods before and after. But one of the outcomes of that was that my mother took myself and my brother and my sister to St. Margaret's Orphanage. They had separated, and she was unemployed, and she couldn't take care of us. And my recollection of that was being in that setting with nuns, and I was, if you will, lost. My brother was my main support at that point because they separated the boys from the girls in the different living and sleeping areas, and so he was there. That lasted for a short period, maybe 2 or 3 months, and then my parents got back together again, and we ended up living off Santa Fe Street, where the present-day I-10 is to be found. They had decided to build it, and the consequence of that is we probably weren't there for longer than, maybe a year.
Okay. So you mentioned your parents. What were your mom and your dad's name, and where were they from?
My mother was Mercedes Schwartz. My mother was born in El Paso. Her mother was Maria Remis, who had been born in Ciudad Juarez, and her father was Frank J. Schwartz, who was a German immigrant. Interestingly enough, I've spent some time recently trying to do genealogy surveys, and I was unable to find Mr. Schwartz outside of El Paso. I found something in the nature of 600 Frank Schwartz coming to America at or about the same time. So it was a very common name. Many of them coming to Texas. There's a large German community in Texas. My grandmother's ancestry goes back maybe another generation beyond her parents, back to Germany, interestingly enough. Her name, again, was R-E-M-I-S, Remis, and that turned out to be a German name. My father is Oscar Alfonso Lewis. He was born in Mexico City. He was the product of a union between Erasmo Lewis Seguin and Maria de Jesús Ornelas. My grandmother, Maria de Jesús Ornelas, was born in Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. My grandfather was born in San Antonio, Texas. And interestingly enough, in recent research, I was able to determine that he was the offspring of Alfred A. Lewis and Josefa Seguin, who was the daughter of Juan Seguin. So what you end up having is roots going back in Texas to, in the early 1700s. I brought along, and you will see in the material, a document I just found, which is my grandmother's citizenship card, establishing that she was an American citizen because of derivation, as evidenced by my grandfather's birth certificate and their marriage license. So derivation, meaning marriage, I'm sorry. And again, my father was a citizen as a result of derivation too. So that's who they were. At the time of my birth, my father and mother were living in Juarez. Juarez back then was larger than the city of El Paso, more cosmopolitan. And if I may take a second, let me tell you a little bit about what I also learned, which I find fascinating because it's kind of the history of Mexicanos in the state of Texas. My mother went into labor on the 14th, Valentine's Day. And My father was in Mexico City at the time, so after the phone calls were made, her neighbor and my father's business partner, Mario Jaques, came over and picked her up after having called her doctor, Dr. Soto, Manuel Soto. Dr. Soto also lived in Juarez, and so Dr. Soto said, get her to the hospital, which was again in El Paso. And so they jumped in their car and they went to the hospital. Dr. Soto did as well. However, back in '47, the border closed at 6 o'clock in the evening. And while my mother got across the border, Dr. Soto did not. The significance of which is that when she arrived at the hospital, she introduced herself as Mercedes Schwartz Lewis. And the Good Sisters of Charity concluded that she couldn't possibly be because she was Mexican. Mario Jaques, of course, was Mexican, and even though he insisted as a witness that that's who she was, and I assume it was noticeable that she was pregnant, they chose not to receive her. So my mother spent her labor in the reception lobby area of the hospital until 6:15 in the morning. The border opened at 6, and Dr. Soto managed to get to the hospital. And he, of course, was known by them since he was a doctor, and he, I suspect, read them the riot act. And the next thing I know is I'm being born approximately an hour later. So welcome to Texas. It's a start to a life that was interesting for me. My parents, my brother and my sister, a brother by the name of Oscar, a sister by the name of Beatriz, moved to the projects when I was 3 years old, Taze Projects in El Paso, and I remained in public housing until I was 21. My mother literally finished her life in public housing. We grew up in an all-Mexican neighborhood with all Mexican neighbors, people just like us in every sense of the word. But because my parents were very pro-education, my mother was able to convince my father that no matter their meager means, that I should be sent to kindergarten. So in the neighborhood, surprisingly, there was a Presbyterian kindergarten by the name of St. Anne's. And I went there. And I went there to have a start, if you will, in my public education, but it was actually a start in something very different. The neighborhoods in El Paso were segregated, especially the black neighborhood. And they only had one public school at the time, which was Douglas School, which was also in my neighborhood. But we weren't in any situation where we were exposed to one another. However, at St. Anne's, the majority of the kindergarten kids were black. And so I found myself in a setting with black children. That's significant in historical terms, primarily because Brown versus Board took place in '54. This was 1953. El Paso was the first public school system to desegregate in the state of Texas. And so when I started the first grade and the second grade, black children started coming to Bell School, and black families started moving into our neighborhood. Regrettably, the Public Housing Authority decided that that was not a good thing, so they segregated the neighborhood by putting up a fence, and on one side of the fence was a black neighborhood, and on the other side of the fence was a Mexican neighborhood. Of course, the kids didn't know anything, so we ran around the fence and got into each other's neighborhood. I stayed at Bell for the period of 7 years because I was held back. My second grade teacher told my parents that I wasn't mature enough. Earlier, you and I talked about my having the same issue with one of my children, and so I have a renewed respect for her judgment. The bottom line is I got through elementary school at Bell, went off to junior high at Jefferson Junior High School, and then continued and graduated from Jefferson High School. In the course of growing up, my parents divorced. I was about 7 years old at that time. And actually, my father asked each of us to pick who they were going with. My brother and my sister picked to go with him, and I chose to stay with my mom.
Were you the eldest?
I was the youngest.
You were the youngest?
Yes. We're separated by 2 years, my brother being the oldest. And I was, in a sense, fortunate for that reason. My father came to acknowledge as much maybe 25 years later. My mother brought me up well. In fact, one of the things I'm very conscious of is that in my life, women have been very important. And of course, my mother was the most important. Life was not a lot easy with her, I don't mind telling you that. She struggled a great deal. She was a minimum wage worker at retail, worked in department stores and in shops and did all manner of sales. Both my parents were alcoholic, but they were what used to be referred to, I guess, as the term escapes me. They could manage their lives in a way where the alcoholism generally didn't interfere. My mother was a weekend alcoholic. My father was a binge alcoholic, which meant that he disappeared for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. In a sense, their divorce helped me because I only had to cope with one. The difficulty with that over time gave rise to disagreements with Mom. But I, in reflection, come to realize that they created in me or instilled in me a sense of self-determination, that I could take care of myself, that I could do things on my own. And that was a blessing. And of course, she reinforced that when she was sober, so to speak, by observing and applauding stuff that I would do that she considered success. I started working early. When I was about 11 years old, I started mowing lawns. I got my first job for pay when I was 13 as a dishwasher at the El Paso del Norte Hotel. Of course, I was told when I was hired that if anybody asked, I was 16. Got out of 34 cents an hour. I was doing really well. My mother taught me an important lesson when I brought my first paycheck home, and that lesson was, that's mine. My mom took it away. And it took me a while to understand. My working was about contributing, was about helping us. A life lesson that fortunately rubbed off. Subsequently, I got a job as a busboy. I was moving on up. I then found a job as a wrapper at a furniture store, American Furniture Company. At that point, I was 16. And then I became a stock boy for the store. Tripped over my next job as a shoe salesman. Sold shoes all through college, and successfully so. In fact, I count one of my managers as a lifelong friend, who happens to be named Mario as well. While all this was going on, I had the neighborhood kids to hang with, and spent most of my time outside of the house. The funny thing was that I happened to live on one side of the street that was part of one school, and everybody else who lived on the other side of the street went to another school, which meant that I would always end up on their campus over time, much to the chagrin of their principal. But that also proved to be lucky for me. The reality was that I ended up at the El Paso Boys Club on Ochoa Street in El Segundo Barrio, and ran into people there who kind of nurtured me, who moved me along. One of them was a gentleman by the name of Salvador Ramirez, who was a director of that place. And later on, actually organized a college in Oregon by the name of Cesar Chavez College. As a result of that, I had to confront the reality, and that reality was that I was not an athlete, and all the kids I hung with were letter persons, you know, lettermen in baseball and tennis and football. And quite frankly, they were somewhat taken aback by this guy from the other school, which was a rival school, hanging. So I had to find a way of creating a relationship. Fortunately, I succeeded. Part of my experiences had been involved in doing promotions for shows at the local community hall. I was involved in sales and in taking entertainers to radio and television studios.
And how old were you during this time?
16, 17. Among the people that I had the good fortune of coming in contact with were James Brown, Fats Domino, Sonny Osuna, and the Sunliners. The consequence of knowing that promotion end of that business got me to talking to them and promoting an activity which ultimately turned into a tardeada. Their one need, the one thing they wanted more than anything else, were club jackets, and there was no way they could ever afford club jackets. I figured if we could raise the money, we could do that, and sure enough, we raised enough money for 42 jackets. Salvador, who again ran the Boys Club, was so impressed with the undertaking that he asked me if I would help put together a program there at the gym, so that everybody in the neighborhood could come and see the allocation of the putting on of jackets. The net result of which was that Butch Campa, who was the actual leader of that community at that time, kid at Bowie High School, formally asked that I be admitted to the group. And then after I was admitted to the group, the gentleman who was most opposed to me, Salvador Alvarado, asked that I be the new leader of the group. And so, in short order, took a little over a year, I was no longer the kid from the opposite school. Okay, that was going on. At the opposite school, my regular school, I was doing well, grade-wise. The reality, though, was that it didn't matter, and the reason it didn't matter was because counselors at the time would say, you know, you should be taking shop. You'll never get into college. I specifically was told that I couldn't compete with Anglos, and I was told specifically by my counselor that no efforts would be made on their part to get me a scholarship because it would have been a waste of money. Mama made a feisty boy. That was not acceptable. As all these events that had been taking place, I was also involved in something else. At the age of 13, a friend of mine and I were playing, and he stopped the game and he said, I gotta go take a shower because I've gotta go to my meeting. I said, what meeting? And he said, well, I belong to Junior LULAC. And I said, what's Junior LULAC? And he said, oh, it's just a group of kids. And I said, okay, can I go? And he said, I don't know. I said, okay. So I went home. A few minutes later, he was there at the door, and he says, my mom says I should take you. So we got on the bus, and we went downtown to what was then the city-county building, and we went into the space that was used by the county commissioners. And there were like 10 or 15 other kids, and a lady, and she welcomed me, and they started having a meeting, and it was literally a meeting. Somebody was chairing, you know, people were following some form of rules and talking about this and that. The lady then made sure that I came back. She asked me if I enjoyed it and told me to come back. The lady's name was Lucy Acosta. Today, I think Lucy is formally recognized in the Texas Women's Hall of Fame.
And what year was this? This was your 16, 17?
I was 13 years old,
13.
So you got to figure that would have been 1960.
Okay. You know, and before we
Sure.
you know, move forward, I wanted to ask, did your mom and dad ever talk to you about life that they had, you know, of them growing up? Because I imagine it would have been smack dab in the middle of the Depression during this time. Did they ever tell you about those stories or stories about their parents?
That is the strangest thing about the divorce. When the divorce came about, I lost all contact with my father's side of the family. I never saw my grandmother again until she was at her funeral. My aunts, my uncles, never had any contact. On my mother's side, it was just my grandmother and my mother. And my grandmother really didn't live with us, came in from time to time. She was a nanny in San Francisco, and so whenever she would get a couple of weeks off, she'd be on the train back to El Paso. And the point of the story, though, is that ultimately we never really talked about who they were in terms of their families, their history. I made reference earlier to doing genealogy. I'm astounded at what I've learned on my own, thank goodness, to the web. But as a practical matter, I'm presently the only one in the family, and this is both sides, who is knowledgeable about who's related to whom and who came from where. And I really regret not having had the opportunity. When my father and I had a rapprochement, approximately, I was 21 years of age, I tried to talk to him about that, and he was reluctant. And I think his reluctance was premised to a major extent on what does it matter, which is not an unusual attitude. But the bottom line is I had to find it out on my own.
And then with your mom being interracial, did this have an impact on her experience, do you think? Or did she ever, talk about it? Or, I mean, is that something that mattered to her or to you?
We didn't talk about it. My mother's appearance, for all practical purposes, is Mexicana. But my mother ran into what I know I run into and what I know my kids run into. There's an assumption when you give them your last name. In my mother's case, Schwartz is a young unmarried woman, and then Lewis is a married woman, for people to start wondering what you were, or where you came from, or what the nature of your ethnic makeup. One of my favorite tales is a woman who became a subsequently very good friend of mine, Margarita Sanchez, here in Austin at a restaurant after I'd known her for maybe 80 hours tops over a course of about 4 weeks. Just stood there and looked at me and said, "¿Qué eres?" And I said, "I beg your pardon? Are you Indian? Are you Mexican? What are you?" The whole point of which is, I think my mother had the same kind of reaction from people, just a query of who they were. I do know this: my grandfathers died very early in their lives. And my suspicion is if my mother knew her father, it was, as an adolescent at the most, not as a grown woman. And I have the same suspicion of my father, that his father probably passed away when he was a kid. My father went to school through the 7th grade, and I have a suspicion that wasn't by choice. I think that was just an economic decision, probably premised on my grandfather's passing. By the way, I'm still trying to figure out when he passed away. I have word out to a different number of relatives who might know. But back to your question, there has, I think, always been a public reaction to name. Not necessarily a good reaction. And when I tell people that my last name, Lewis, is 6 generations old that I can track back and 5 generations old in Texas, but that thereafter everybody else is Mexicano, they kind of look at me askance. There's a lack of belief. No, muestro. Taking you back to when I was 13 and meeting Lucy Acosta. Lucy Acosta was a very active woman in LULAC, but her main interest was in developing young Mexicanos, young Chicanitos, and I owe her a great deal. She encouraged me, she taught me. By the time I was 14 or 15, I was an expert on Robert's Rules of Order, to the point that the senior LULACers would use me at their meetings, especially at the district level, to resolve disputes.
Whenever you were 13, prior to entering LULAC, did you face any type of, what was your experience also growing up in El Paso? I mean, it's a heavy Mexican-American population, so did you have any experiences where you didn't feel maybe as if you fit in, or if you fit in just fine, you didn't have any problems, up to that point? Because LULAC it's a big, obviously, civil rights organization, so was something that was leading you to this moment, or Well, I guess what was your experience dealing with race and growing up in El Paso?
Under the age of 10, the world was Mexican. Okay. Most of my teachers were, and to the extent I had Anglo teachers, they were from the Northeast, typically spouses of Fort Bliss soldiers who were just there for the interim period, who didn't bring Texas biases with them. And so as a consequence, we were just children, and we were treated like children, very respectfully. I remember when I was held back in first or second grade. The reason I keep saying first or second is I can't remember if it was Mrs. Dickerson or Mrs. Allen, but one of those two teachers held me back. She was from Massachusetts, and the reason I remember that distinctly is because one of the treats she gave us was maple syrup that her parents had sent to her for distribution. So that was probably my first taste of real maple syrup. By the way, I have an excellent memory. I can remember tremendous details. And the reason I mention that is because my wife keeps saying, you couldn't possibly remember that. Going back to Lucy, if I may. The reason Lucy keeps coming up, just in terms of my bringing her up, is because she actually was the reason that I ended up doing most of my choices in life later on. When I joined Junior LULAC, I became aware that there was a very large concerted effort at finding us a place. And I learned things like that El Paso was predominantly Mexican, but that we didn't vote. That El Paso was predominantly poor, but most poor people were brown and the non-poor were not. I learned things like resources were allocated to newer schools as opposed to older schools. And of course, if you think about what the older schools were, they were the first schools that ultimately had been built in that part of town that was now progressively becoming, or had already become, Mexican. There were really no visible signs of role models. We had a mayor, Raymond Diaz, who the whole community got behind, who was adored in my own household. But the truth of the matter is that he came and went, and nothing really changed, which is not the case now, but we'll talk about that in a second. The reality was that I started seeing the world with different eyes. As I got involved more and more with LULAC, I became the state director for Junior LULAC, and met Mario Obledo for the first time. He was the state director for Senior LULAC. But in coming to becoming that, I came for the first time from El Paso, Texas, to Beaumont, Texas. And Beaumont was the site of the state convention. And the outing involved one adult and 4 kids. And on our first stop, late at night in Osuna, Texas, about 11 o'clock at night, in Osuna, Texas, we went into a restaurant, and they not only didn't serve us, they told us why they didn't serve us. They said very simply, we don't serve Mexicans. I'd heard of that, but I never saw it before. It was shocking and literally unexplainable. You know, did we do anything wrong? That kind of thing. Ended up coming to Beaumont with that under my belt, so to speak. Ran and became the state director. Went back. We made very little effort to stop any place.
What year was that? Or how old were you?
That would have been, I think it's in the documents I brought you, but I'm going to guess at this point it would have been about 1963. Okay. The following year, I was on a bus headed to the state convention in Corpus Christi. Actually headed to the national convention in Corpus Christi. And we had the same experience in Floresville. We stopped for breakfast at 6 o'clock in the morning, and a sheriff's officer drove up to our bus, went into the restaurant, and asked, as though it weren't apparent, whose bus that was. And the driver got up, and he says, "Where are you taking these people to?" And he said, "To their convention. It's a LULAC convention in Corpus." And he says, "Okay, you have 30 minutes to get out of my county." And we all got up, a busload of adults and young people, and got on the bus, and we drove out of the county. Again, strange. I'll tell you one reason now in life it seems even stranger. Floresville was named after a relative of mine and was the home site of Erasmo Seguin, who was Juan Seguin's father. So we've been there for a very, very long time, but apparently in 1964, more or less, we were not welcomed. In Corpus, I ran and became the national president of Junior LULAC. Again, I'm pretty sure it was 64. And we had the same incident in Corpus. On Sunday morning, before we were ready to go back to El Paso, we went to have an early lunch, about 11 o'clock, at a Spanish restaurant. They wouldn't serve Mexicans at the Spanish restaurant in Corpus Christi. And I kept wondering whether that was the way it was all outside of El Paso. Because in El Paso, I had not seen that. I had not run into that. And my mom and dad had shared stories about the signs that used to say, "No dogs, no soldiers, and no Mexicans." But, you know, they were stories, and they had to taken place at a time before I was born. So this was alarming, shocking. Now, I'll tell you a couple of things about the city of El Paso back at this period of time, because it's relevant to what else went on. El Paso is still politically dominated by a small group of white men, mostly the bankers. I'm not just telling you this because I know it, I'm telling you this because if you do any research on El Paso, you'll find out primarily the Young family ran the city of El Paso. There were a few people over time who became aldermen in the city. Salvador Terán was an alderman. Hector Bencomo was an alderman. The city's politics changed so that every new election brought a ticket with a mayor and potentially 4 or 5 councilmen. It was always at large, and in every instance they had one of us. Okay, and typically it was one of us who had respect in the community, but when it came to votes, there were no real outcomes of any consequence that you could point to and say, "Hey, this all ended up better." If you wanted to know about the streets, the better streets were in the better neighborhoods, meaning where the money was. There were whole neighborhoods who had been in place for 60, 70 years, whose roads were still not paved, who didn't have sidewalks. I did a survey while I was at UTEP for my political science class of residences, tenements in South El Paso. And there's a big vector problem, mosquitoes, flies. And it seemed to me that if tenements were required to have screens, they could have screens. So I went to the health department and I asked, how do we go about getting screens for the tenements, screen doors, screens on the windows? And I was told, no, we can't do that. That requires a city ordinance. And I said, well, okay, how do we get a city ordinance? And they said, no, we can't do that. And I said, why not? And they said very simply, because if you require screen doors on residential areas, the people up on Rim Road, which was then the wealthiest part of town, will fight it tooth and nail. They don't want screens on their fancy houses. And it was a defeatist attitude, but later on I did some research and came to find out that the head of the health department owned the largest number of tenements in South El Paso. So maybe I was being told the truth, maybe I wasn't, but in a sense that's the way the world was at that point in time. So I was having more practical exposure to the realities of what life was like for being a Mexicano.
So the fight for the screen, that was post high school graduation. So this is your college,
my first year of
years.
college, actually. Yeah, I'll tell you another story about that in a second in terms of a survey, but I'll stop now and go back to my good friend Lucy. So in 64, 65, I'm entering my junior year. I'm getting ready to figure out what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I know my mother can't support and can't support a college education. I know that's not possible. And I want to go to college. So I've now been told that I'm not going to get a scholarship or scholarship assistance. I've now been told that I can't compete. And so I sit down with Lucy and I say, you know, I want to go to college, but this is what I'm told. And she said, okay, I want you to tell me who it was. So I did. I quite frankly was not concerned. I was willing to stand up for it. So she went to talk to them. And they told her, in better terms or more polite terms, well, you know, Mario just really doesn't have what it takes to make it in college. So on the occasion of my graduation, literally at the awards assembly, which I understand is still a practice in high schools, all the kids that were to receive some kind of an award or a scholarship were identified, and then all of a sudden they're on stage as Lucy Acosta. And she announces that I'm getting a 4-year scholarship to Texas Western, which is what the name of the school was at that time. Blew me away. The only thing she asked of me afterwards is, you make sure you do something with that for us. And not a hard commitment to make. So I graduated from school and I had a scholarship, and as my mother said to me, mijo, el techo y los frijoles siempre los vas a tener. So I'm here for that.
Was your mom very supportive whenever you told her you were going to go? You were going to these LULAC meetings. Did she?
Yes, she was. There was only one time she rebelled, and it was a big rebellion. She was. She always was supportive of it. Even travel. Can you imagine a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old traveling across country without any money? Okay. Never mind how we did it, but we did it. Yes, she was. However, when I became national president, she and I had one of those periodic disagreements that really escalates. And she threw me out of the house. And very remarkably, in the poorest home in the neighborhood, I found a place to stay. And that was Ramona Reséndez. When Ramona found out from her nephew that I, had been thrown out, she literally picked me up out of the collar off the street and she took me inside the house. And I knew that they were barely making it, and there was another mouth to feed. And, it was really tough. I was in a tenement, and even though I lived in the projects, we had running water inside. They didn't have running water in the tenement. They didn't have hot water. It was kind of like bring it in from the one spigot outside and then boil it and then put it in a tina, and that's how you take a bath. It took my mother about 4 weeks. Lucy showed up the very next day after she found out. And Mrs. Reséndez and Nona is what I called her, and Lucy had a discussion about where this kid was going to go to live, and they finally resolved it by leaving me there, and which was great. I was happy with that. Took my mother about a couple of weeks, and we negotiated and reconciled, and that literally was the end of the turmoil. It just ended. I would tell you that was about age 16, 17. So yes, she was always supportive before that time and after that time, but at that one point in time, my mother had a lot of real difficult issues. For one thing, as a woman, she had a hard time keeping a job whenever there were layoffs. No matter if she was the one who taught the man who came through the door. It was just, she's gone. My mother, in a very short period of time, ended up with a marriage ending, ended up losing all her teeth, ended up with emotional problems that resulted in her having hives. I mean, there was all that stuff going on. And then aside from that, she had to raise this one kid. So it wasn't easy for her. But she held it together. She held it together all through the rest of her life. She was literally always there. Literally always there. No matter, we had bumps, but everybody in the world has bumps. So I'm in college.
How was she, whenever you told her you got this 4-year scholarship, what was her reaction?
She had adored Lucy before, and literally adored her after. At one time, Lucy tried to convince my mother to join the Ladies LULAC Council that Lucy was involved in, and my mother had gone 2 or 3 times, and I really was looking forward to that because I thought it was a great environment. It was a great intellectual stimulus. It was a good social network, all those things. And my mother came to me one day and she says, "It's not for me." And I said, "Why not?" She says, "They have resources. I don't. I cannot afford it. They have jobs and they have husbands and I cannot afford to do that." And I guess that was one of those times in my life where I came to realize it's really tough for her. It really is tough for her. Her social network, most of my life, was very, very, very small. 2 or 3 friends, and not the everyday kinds of friends, but the ones that would come and visit maybe once every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and they'd go off to the beauty parlor maybe, or lunch or something like that. That kind of changed later in her life in that when she retired, my mother got cancer, ovarian cancer, and she went through the turmoil of remission and then return and remission. But over that span of say, age 61, 62, and 72 when she died, she devoted her life to being a volunteer at Thomason General Hospital, literally doing everything from running stuff from here to there to sitting at reception. At one point, she was acknowledged as one of the highest hour contributors at the hospital. That actually gave her a new life. She stopped drinking. She bonded with 2 or 3 women who worked there. It was a different woman altogether, and a very happy woman. Coming back to college.
So whenever you were 13 and joining LULAC, and I guess this is the time where, before you become the National Youth Director, what were some of the I guess, activities or causes that your particular LULAC group championed?
Well, we were primarily fundraising for scholarships, so we did that. We also, in my capacity, I was also called upon to go do speaking to different organizations, to LULAC councils. The senior organization took a lot of interest in me. It sounds braggadocious, but I was able to convey ideas relatively simply, and I was articulate, that kind of stuff. Just as an aside, on one occasion I was asked to speak to the New Mexico State Convention in Las Cruces, and I was supposed to be the number 2 speaker. The number 1 speaker was, at the keynotes, the number 1 speaker was a gentleman who was the lieutenant governor. And they asked me to go first. And while I remember the substance of the remarks, in effect, I got a standing ovation. It was a very pleasant kind of reaction. He subsequently took the stage and he looked at me and he looked at them and he looked at me and he looked at them and he said, "Hey, I ain't going to do anything after him." And he walked off the podium. So it was good. It worked both ways. I got a lot out of it. Confidence, the knowledge that I could communicate. All of which, of course, works in the direction of where I'm going. And where I'm going is to become a lawyer.
And that was for recruitment purposes of the speech that you gave?
The speech was to reinforce the value of doing what we were doing as LULAC, which after time, quite frankly, I thought was not enough. But at the time, there wasn't anything else. They were the only thing that was progressive, they were the only thing that was organized, and they were the only thing that was championing issues that concerned us.
And what were some of those issues?
Back then, we're talking about promoting the school of the Little 400, which turned out to be Head Start. It was ending some of the Jim Crow laws in the state of Texas, like poll tax. It was trying to get us elected to public positions and being unsuccessful at it, primarily because things were all at large. And when you don't represent a large number of the voting population and even fewer, registered population, and even fewer of the voters, you don't really get a lot accomplished. So those learning experiences didn't leave me. They actually became the reason for my seriously saying I've got to come back to El Paso. And again, Lucia told me, no más no se te olvide. Just don't forget us.
Were there other activities that you participated in high school outside of LULAC?
Sure. I was in the Honor Society, Junior Honor Society. I didn't make the Senior Honor Society. I was a little wayward at the time. I was in school government. Actually ran for student body president with my 3 best friends and didn't win. Ran against my 3 best friends and ran with 2 friends of mine who are still friends to this day. Juan Sandoval, who at one point was the city tax collector of the city of El Paso, and Elia Perez, who works for the State Center on mental health related issues. As far as the friends, Fernando Casas and Jose Luis Loya. Jose Luis Loya became student body president. These are still lifelong friends. I mean, we're still in the same communications network, so to speak. The junior year of high school, I also was asked to go to Boys State, American Legion Boys State here in Austin. It was literally one of the first times that I ever went to a government operations training activity. I knew how city councils worked and I knew how commissioners worked, but I didn't know the legislative process. And if you're familiar with Boys State, what they do is they bring you to a place like Austin and they have you break out in terms of selection, voting, and the like into cities and then counties and ultimately legislative positions and then governor. Interestingly enough, there's a congressman now by the name of McCall who ended up being governor of Boys State when I was in Boys State. I happened to be one of the people supporting him. But one of the things that was apparent to me at Boys State was that there weren't a lot of Mexicanos. I would venture to guess that year there were probably about 300 kids, and I would say maybe 3 blacks, maybe 4 or 5 Mexicanos, statewide. And even though we weren't the numbers we are today, we were still very significant in terms of population ratios. And I was aware of it. I was also aware of the attitudes of some of the boys. I had already traveled across the state and therefore knew what one might run into. I also met a man who was Colonel Washington, who was with the American Legion in El Paso. He was a black gentleman, and I met him in connection with American Legion Boys State because he was there when we left and personally introduced himself, and he was there when we returned, and then subsequently the American Legion asked me to speak on behalf of that class to the new class the following year. The Colonel and I ran into each other in '84. He came by my office, and I was practicing privately at the time, and he asked me, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course I do." And he says, "I remember you." And I said, "Really? Oh, okay." And he said, "Mario, we picked you to go to Boys State." And I said, "We?" And he said, "That's not important." And it was kind of like I was blessed. There were angels in my world, and they were looking out for me. We named a school after Colonel Washington at Isleta at a time that I was the lawyer for Isleta Independent School District. An easy thing to do based on his history of commitment to that community. An unsung hero up until then, but be that as it may. So I was part of Boys State in high school, part of government, in drama. I had ended up in drama when I was a freshman and ran into a woman by the name of then Lucy Gadry, who became Lucy Amodio. I'm sorry, I said Lucy. I didn't mean that. Liz Amodio, Liz Handan, Liz Gadry, and so on and so on. She actually retired not too long ago from the El Paso Independent School District. An influence in my life. Like I tell you, women really influenced me. She plucked me out of the air, so to speak. She had a tournament that she had to take a student to. Didn't know what to do because she didn't have a student. Talked to the speech teacher, and she took me, and it was for something called extemporaneous speaking. I was put in a room, given some magazines, did what I was told to do. We got back in the car and drove back to the school, and when I stepped out of the car, I said, Miss Gadry, how do I know how I did? And she says, oh, in a day or two, I'll check. Well, I actually won the competition. So it was kind of like, hey, this kid's okay. So she literally took me under the wing. I ended up in debate. I ended up doing persuasive speaking, contemporaneous speaking, all through high school. And of course, since she was the actual drama instructor, I got pulled into a few plays, which were fun. Both my children ended up doing drama in high school, and they turned out to be remarkable. Neither of which picked that as a career, but the bottom line is the genes must have been there. We ended up at UTEP. UTEP was a cultural awakening. It was the first setting where I was with nothing but white students. At the time, I'm going to tell you the enrollment was probably about 5,000. It isn't the UTEP that it is today. Today, UTEP is nationally recognized as the best bilingual, bicultural institution in this country, thanks to Dr. Natalicio. Remarkable transference. It's headed to Tier 1 and ain't that far away. When I went there, there were a few professors on campus who were Hispanic. One of them was J.R. Provencio. He was a doctor in physics. He approached me and he said, you know, I understand you're with LULAC, I'm with LULAC too. Why don't we organize something here on campus? And so we tried. We created something called LULAC Alpha. It lasted only 1 year. I think I got 4 students interested in it. But ultimately, there was not a large enough population. And then there was something else going on. That something else later became Mecha. It wasn't on campus then, but there were people arriving at the campus who had an interest in it. Pt1, who subsequently became the executive director of Thomas and General Hospital in El Paso. Carmen Rodriguez, who was or is an attorney, was a partner of mine at one point, and is the wife of Senator Jose Rodriguez. They were on campus, and they were working with a network of people who, interestingly enough, I was not a part of. Not that I should have been, but I came to find this out later. LULAC Alpha failed, and I started devoting my attention to studies. I'm working now at a shoe store at the White House, and approximately the beginning of my junior year, I go for coffee. And that means I go from the annex of the store across the breezeway into the main building and across the first floor. And as I'm walking by Notions, which is a department for jewelry and handkerchiefs and scarves and the like, I see a young woman. And I look at her and I say, hey, good looking, what's cooking? And she turns around and she looks at me and she says, are you talking to me? I said, yeah. Is there something you'd like to buy? I said, no, I just wanted to meet you. Have we been introduced? No, but let me introduce myself. And she says, I'm sorry, I don't talk to men that have not been introduced to. And she turned around and she kept doing what she was doing. Well, you know what? I like that. So I went to coffee, came back, she was still there. I said, hi, ignored. And that went on for a few days. Well, that young woman was Maria Guadalupe Aguilera, who became my wife in 1972. We're now talking 4 years later for all practical purposes. She and I ended up dating, and we dated most of my junior and senior year, actually the middle of my junior year and all my senior year. She was going to school at the same time, but she was going to night classes. So the only place I ever saw her was at the White House in notions in terms of the probabilities of running into her.
The White House, that's a
Department store.
That's a department store. Okay.
There were one of two large department stores in El Paso, Popular Dry Goods and the White House. My mother worked at both stores in her youth and later on after marriage, which is one of the things that I do need to tell you. You see, my wife was standing on the first floor, and right downstairs in the basement, right below her, was ladies' hats. Millinery is what they called it. And in 1938, my mother was the manager, the first woman manager of any department store in El Paso, of millinery. And one day, a gentleman came in to buy a hat for his mother. And that gentleman was Oscar Lewis. And so my mother and my father met one floor below where my wife and I met. That was remarkable. I tell that story all the time because, again, the fates are the fates. We were destined to be there and to be where we are now, 47 years later. We parted company because I went off to law school, and we didn't part, according to her, under very good circumstances. I said, you know, it's not fair for me to go off and leave you here waiting when I really don't know what's going to happen, and I don't think it's fair for me to say don't date anybody, or for me to commit not to dating anybody. And she said, you're leaving me? Yes, I am. And as it turns out, I went away. I should tell you about the transition, though, about going away, because that was another instance where the fates were with me.
Well, before we get to
Sure.
that one, I was wondering if you were talking about these issues or these instances where you were deliberately discriminated against. What was your response? I mean, it's shock, but how did you, or how, I guess, what was the response?
Apart from sharing it with somebody, it was stored. Powerlessness is the most common thing in our lives, particularly when we run into somebody who either is or believes themselves to be powerful. When a sheriff tells you to get out of the county now, you get out of the county now. When a restaurant says they won't serve you, they won't serve you. So there was literally nothing that I could do or that the people I was with could do. Oh, we could have been, you know, vulgar or made noise or whatever, but even then that wasn't part of the culture. Demonstrativeness was something, oh yeah, you walked out with a frown, but beyond that you didn't do very much. And so no, there was no reaction. We shared the stories. We told other people about our life experience, who also were, as you are, how could that be? Or why didn't you do something about it? And I suspect, I don't recall specifically, but I suspect we had somewhat the same conversation. What can you do? So, one step back, if I may, and one step back was that I decided to become a lawyer when I was 13. And the reason I decided was in the nature of two things. One of them was something called Perry Mason. My mother was a devotee. She watched Perry Mason every week. And I was always fascinated by Perry Mason. The other thing is I had a cousin by the name of Albert Purchase, Mexicano. Okay? In fact, the largest number of funeral homes in Mexico are owned by the Purchase family. Regrettably, they're not related. But the name is found all over Mexico. Coming back to 13, my cousin Albert actually was a lawyer. My cousin Albert had been a pilot in World War II in the Army Air Corps, And he had succeeded in getting to the Army Air Corps, notwithstanding that he had glasses and notwithstanding that he was 5 foot tall. It's another great example of if you want something, you work at it. So he got in. And one of the net rewards was the GI Bill, and he had gone to Texas Western. So when he got a GI Bill, he went to SMU, graduated from SMU, and ended up working for General Dynamics. Now, my cousin's 20 years older than I am. So when I'm 13, okay, you're now looking at a gentleman who's 33 years old and who is, for lack of a better word, the most respected human being in my family. Everybody talks about Alberto, el abogado. You know? So I kind of said to myself, that's something you aspire to. That's something you want to become. That's a degree of respect you'd like to have. Now, if you say to yourself, wait a minute, 13-year-old having these thoughts, the short answer is I did. You know, I don't know why, I don't know how I came about it, but there I was. So when I was 13, that's what I wanted to become. So throughout high school, I'm in debate. I know I can handle myself on my feet. When I'm in college, I'm doing other stuff in terms of organizing people and trying to convince people about stuff. So I know I can do that. The only thing I kind of get lost in is how to get from here to there. And like I say, I've had angels. I'm just about to graduate, maybe 3 or 4 months to graduate from college. And it's kind of like you got to do something. So I ask around, you know, what do you do? And they said, you're too late. What do you mean I'm too late? Well, man, you know, they accepted applications in January to go to law school. There's no way you can get to law school. And if you wanted a scholarship or something, there's no way you can get a scholarship. I'm saying, okay, and then you have to take the LSAT. So it's kind of like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And this is where my wife normally would say, he had it easy. Well, things started to happen. I sent out applications. I sent applications to the University of Texas, which is where I wanted to go, to Notre Dame University, to Georgetown University, to the University of Denver. And the reason I reach out and look at you when I say that is because I never heard of the University of Denver. One of my friends said, that's where I'm going, so I sent an application. Where did I want to go? I want to go to University of Texas. If I didn't get into the University of Texas, I wanted to go to Georgetown. Where was I likely to go? I wasn't likely to go anywhere, okay? Then I took my LSAT and I sent my LSAT scores. Then I got my final transcripts and I sent out my final transcripts. A week or two before I got my final transcripts, somebody said to me, hey, did you know there's a Clio Institute at Lubbock? And I said, Clio? What the heck is Clio? And I was told, Clio is the Council on Legal Education Opportunity. And as it turns out, it is a recruitment program for minority students. And in the Southwest, it was primarily for Mexicanos. So I sent an application, and I got a letter back saying, you're too late. There's no way we can get you in. So in a sense, what they were going to offer me was something akin to 6 weeks of a law school setting experience where I would learn what it was to go to law school. And in addition, they would give me a monthly stipend. And if you think about it, there's no monthly stipend coming into my household. By the way, I also learned that you couldn't work. And my expectations was that I could go anywhere and work and go to law school. So it was kind of like, oh. And then I got a phone call from a gentleman by the name of Steve Lee. And he said, Mario, we've gotten the documentation, including your LSAT score, and I have a vacancy. One of the students turned us down here at Arizona State. Would you like to come? And I said, well, when do I have to be there? He said, Monday morning. I said, I'm there. So I got in my car and I went to Arizona State, and Monday morning I was sitting in a classroom with about, I think 6 blacks and about 7 Hispanics and 1 or 2 Asians. Just to give you an insight as to who the Hispanics were, the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of New Mexico, and her name is going to run away, Macias, was one of my co-students. The former Speaker of the head of the State Senate in New Mexico, Manny was one of the students. Now I can't think of his last name. It'll come to me. In any event, people who ended up, in a real sense, leading the state of New Mexico were sitting next to me. Patricio Casey, another Hispanic with a good old Irish last name, ended up being one of the nationally recognized litigation attorneys. Emilio Iñiguez from Sonora, who is one of the partners in one of the largest law firms in Phoenix. That's who these people were. And it was a blessing for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is it was the same, they were the same as I was. They were the same model I had kind of fostered in me in terms of the difficulties and the insights and the inner character strength. I finished Clio, and while I was in Clio, I got a letter from the University of Texas that said very politely, "We don't think you have the academic ability to succeed in law school, so we are not admitting you." Made me a little angry. No, it made me very angry. At the time, and I still believe it to this day, it wasn't about my academic ability, it was about other considerations. I think they had the number of Hispanics, which would have been one or two that they needed, and that was the end of it. I was depressed, I was disappointed, but that went away within about a week because Georgetown University accepted me, Notre Dame accepted me, and I got into a bidding war. Arizona State offered me a position in the incoming class, and when I explained to Steve that I still had income-related issues, he said, "Not a problem, you can live with us." He offered me a place in his home for which I will ever be grateful, and he arranged with the university to have me work as a clerk in the library at night so that I could both do my studies and earn an income. And that was wonderful. I mean, talk about a blessing.
And that was all at Arizona State?
Arizona State. But Steve made a mistake. Steve invited me for coffee. This is Tempe. One afternoon, right before I was going to leave. And as I walked in and sat down, a gentleman literally stumbled in front of our table. And they looked at each other, and Steve got up and he shook the gentleman's hand almost off the arm, and he says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm recruiting," and he says, "It's a good thing you haven't met Mario Lewis." And Steve said, the gentleman sat down and he said, "My name is Michael Rice." Michael Rice turned out to be a professor at the University of Southern California School of Law. We had a little discussion. In the context of the discussion, Steve mentioned that I'd been accepted to Georgetown, and that was actually my first choice, but that he had persuaded me to go to Arizona State. There was something in the nature of an interview, but it was conversational, and Steve kept saying, "No, leave him alone, leave him alone." I went home to Texas, to El Paso, and I got a phone call from from Michael. And Michael said, "I've already talked to the to the admission staff, and the admission staff has given me the authorization to make you an offer to come to University of Southern California." And I said, "Where is that?" And he said, "USC." And I said, "Where is that?" He said, "Football. You ever heard of the Rose Bowl?" And I said, "I don't follow football." And he said, "Well, never mind that. That may sound awfully naive and kind of unenlightened on the part of most people, but I really didn't then, and I still don't follow football." And so the consequence of that was that I really didn't know what this was. But I did know something. And what I knew was that I didn't want to go to California. Because ever since I was a little boy living in the projects, my best friends every year would disappear. And the reason they would disappear is because the family would pack up and they'd go to the Pisca. Okay? They would go to do tomatoes, to do grapes, to do lettuce. And I would turn 7, and this summer so-and-so's gone, and I would turn 8, and this summer so-and-so's gone. So California rung to me as a place where people go get swallowed up. And I wanted to go east. That's why I wanted to go to Georgetown. Well, to make a very long story short, and you're mostly much aware that I don't, I ended up going to USC. And never had a class with Michael, interestingly enough, but things do change. At USC, I had a very good and a very bad reception. The good reception was that half the class was made up of what was then considered minorities. That's 180 students, half of whom were either women, blacks, Asians, or Hispanics. I don't mind telling you that the number of Hispanics was limited to about 5, the number of blacks was limited to about 5, and the number of Asians was limited to about 6. All the rest were women. That was a good thing because I don't know if you know it or not, it was actually the first law school in the country to admit women on almost a one-for-one basis. So again, I get thrown into a setting where it's normal, okay? This is the way it is. The Hispanic students I found interesting after a time because half of them were not from California, myself included. And subsequently, I kind of came to conclude that the reason they recruit out of state is they don't want them to stay here. If you think about it, the largest barrio in the United States of America is East Los Angeles. So why are they coming to Texas and New Mexico? But be that as it may. The bad thing about SC was that we ran into a number of people at the very beginning, first year, including a gentleman by the name of Richard Epstein. Mr. Epstein started his first day of class by saying, many of you don't belong here. You're taking the seat of more worthy people, and I have no intentions of spending any time dealing with you. So if you plan to ask questions, don't worry about it. You're not going to get called on. If you do some research on the gentleman today, he's at the University of Chicago, and he's adamant about several issues that you could comprehend as being wrong-headed. One of them was that the whole civil rights legislation of 64, 65, 67 was wrong-headed, that the federal government had no business doing non-discrimination in employment, doing Title IX in terms of affording women the same educational resources, all that kind of stuff. And he's also one of the founders of the Federalist Society, which, if you give it some present-day thought, is where people like Supreme Court member Alioto, Gorsuch, and others come from. Conservative, if you will, view. You may also recall that Bakke was being considered at that time, and one of the things that took place in my sophomore year, at the beginning of the year, after the Supreme Court decided Bakke, was we were asked to justify our being present at the school. And it was kind of like hostile. But there were other things going on.
And what year was this?
1970, 71.
Were you, smack dab in the middle of the, 60s and 70s, were you influenced by what was occurring, in the context of 1960s and 70s America? So there's anti-war protests, there's a lot of other social movements that are going on. Did you hear about these things? Did you know them? Or did that kind of, you were focused on other important issues, but did you hear about it or had any experience with it?
Well, I arrived in Los Angeles in August of 1970, and 2 days later, there was what I consider to be a murder at the Silver Dollar Cafe in East Los Angeles, Ruben Salazar. When I left El Paso, I believed that LULAC's approach was the correct approach. When I arrived in Los Angeles, the world changed. Approximately the 16th of September, I was recruited among all the students at the school who were Hispanic to participate in the 16th of September Remembrance March as monitors. For that honor, I was bestowed a little white ribbon to be put around the arm. And the purpose of the ribbon was to have the marchers identify somebody who could give them legal advice. I marched with that group all the way to East Los Angeles, where I saw the Metro Squad surround them, and myself included, and beat heads like crazy. I mean, it was a police riot, and it wasn't the only one. That night, I literally spent the night inside a shop that was locked up and the lights turned off because the Metro Squad, which is the Sheriff's Department's Metro Squad, was walking up and down the streets, literally maintaining a curfew, which was to prevent anybody who was Hispanic from getting together with anybody who was Hispanic. Hundreds of kids were being held in fenced areas outside of jails. The next morning, we left there and we went to help provide advice. Now, I'm a law student who hasn't even been in class for more than a week, and we're providing advice. And fundamentally, the training that we received was simply training about you have a right to remain silent, anything you say, maybe, etc. Okay? And so I got to see close up and uncomfortably how the police were reacting. I got to see the media characterize what had taken place. And what the white media was saying was not the same thing as KMEX, which was the PBS station. Okay? And KMEX had it right. After all, they just lost their #1 reporter. Okay? Within a few weeks after that, now I'm in law school, there is an incident at the Biltmore Hotel. The claim is that 6 individuals were trying to create an arson fire when the governor of the state of California was in the hotel. And one of the people that I'm associating with now at the law school invites me over to a law office where I meet for the first time Oscar Zeta Acosta. And what Oscar and other lawyers were doing is they were trying to put together a defense. So about 12 law students were given assignments to go do some research, very basic research. The politics of the whole thing, really flipped, and the news media started kind of getting better information, and they started questioning who did what to whom and who was going where and who sounded the alarm. And after a while, we were told that we were not necessary by the lawyers, and we pulled back from that. I don't know if you recall the outcome, but the ultimate outcome is that all charges were dismissed. It served as an example of how there was an attempt to create this impression that these people, who happened to be us, were rabble-rousers and troublemakers and criminals. Okay? One of my favorite stories is that my wife and I got married in 1972. A year and a half into law school, and I took her back to California to continue law school. And one day I got called and asked if I could be a monitor for the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets were going to be marching in Long Beach in an effort to take back the island of, the Big Island, off the coast. And I don't remember, but it'll come to me. The long and short of it is that there were about 35 Brown Berets, and they were marching down the street. And there were two of us on one side of the street and 2 of us on the other, and there was a police presence. Okay. And in a little while, this unmarked car, by the way, you only march on one side of the street, not the middle, so I said the middle, but this unmarked car went down one direction and then went up the other direction. And out of the back window was this telephoto lens, and he kept taking pictures of each of the individuals. And in a little while, he started taking pictures of the crowd. And as they're moving along, my wife is walking on the sidewalk behind the parade watchers. And she calls to me, and I walk over, and I said, ¿Qué pasó? And she says, why is that man taking my picture? And I said, well, he could be the Metro Squad, he could be the FBI. I said, the bottom line is you have a dossier now. I have a dossier. Everybody here has a dossier. And she said, but why? All I'm doing is, I'm here with you, I'm just watching. And I said, it's called intimidation. And I went back to the marchers, and I'm marching on the side. And after a while, she runs right by me, literally runs right by me, runs up to the front of the marchers, gets in line. There are about 4 lines of marchers. And the next thing you know, she's going, Chicano, power, Chicano. And that was the 180-degree turn of my wife politically. Okay, not that she hadn't been politically sensitive before. She hadn't been demonstrably politically sensitive. It was a great day, absolutely great day. I love telling that story, and she's proud of that moment. There were dossiers. A whole bunch of them were subsequently destroyed. I believe mine was too, because after a while, many years later, actually on 2 occasions, received a security clearance, a top secret, and if I'd had a dossier, they would have been concerned about that. But the bottom line is, yes, I was involved in what was going on, and I was involved in it, okay, in a service kind of like way. At the law school, I told you about the kinds of negative kinds of stuff. There were also some really interesting, wonderful human beings. There was a woman by the name of Valerie Bannerman. Valerie is, well, she's in private practice now, family law. But at the time, she was the director of something called the Legal Aid Foundation of Long Beach. And she was a clinical professor. Valerie hired me the first summer. I think that's correct. Hired me the first summer to clerk at the Legal Aid Foundation. So again, I'm being afforded an opportunity to go down the public service route. Terry Hatter. Terry Hatter was the director of the Western Center on Law and Poverty. Terry's now a federal district judge. Terry taught a class on poverty and the law. Exceptional, he was putting a book together at the time, exceptional class. My favorite image of law school is his then draft book, which was about this thick, had a cover picture of the 1964 Olympics where the runners have their hands up in the air. There was a gentleman who was both the devil and an angel. His name was William Bishan. Mr. Bishan, for all intents and purposes, had been hired for the express purpose of doing damage to the freshman class, specifically to create a significant attrition. In California, law schools are measured in terms of subsequent recruitment on the basis of how well they do on the bar exam. And if you do badly, then you're not considered to be a good school. And if you do real well, then you're considered to be a great school. And SC, and I'm pretty sure the others, had a program where they weaned as much as a third of the class, okay, maybe more. And so he taught a class which was interesting. It was titled Law, Language, and Ethics. And it was confusing, odd, no rhyme or reason. Materials were brought in every day for us to read the next day. It was just very, very strange. And so on the occasion of our preparing for the final exam, he said the only ethics portion of this test is don't cheat. And it was kind of like, how can you cheat on something that you don't understand? So at 1 o'clock in the morning in the library the night before the exam, I'm sitting there perplexed about what I'm going to do. And there's a gentleman sitting there, and I go over to him, and his name is Michael Clutter. Michael turned out to be the #1 student at the law school, and ultimately was the last law clerk for Justice William O. Douglas. And I asked Michael, what are you doing for tomorrow? And he says, what have you been getting all semester? I said, I don't know what you mean. He says, you've been getting something all semester we all have. And I said, okay, tell me what that is. He says, smoke. They shovel smoke at you, and when you're cut through it, they shovel more. And I said, okay, so? And he says, shovel smoke. And I said, you mean give them bullshit? And he said, that's what I'm going to do. On the day of posting grades, they posted everybody's name and all the grades in terms of where they were in the class. More than half of the class got a 55. 55 is the lowest you can get, and by the way, you can't pass a class without a 72. So more than half the class got a 55. There were only 3 people who got above 80. Michael Clutter got, I believe, an 88. Alana Peters got, I believe, an 86, and Mario Lewis got an 83. And I got a letter from him saying that I was the reason he was teaching law school. And he is the reason that I knew I could pass any class in that law school. Strange people.
And one more time of why you chose USC over these other schools?
They made it worth my while, for lack of a better description. I had no resources and I couldn't work. And even though I'd been offered a job at Arizona State, the reality was I'd rather focus on my learning than work. And so I had a Clio Scholarship of what it was approximately $100 a month for 9 months. There's a document that I provided you that says this is what you're getting. USC awarded me something in the neighborhood of about $160 a month, okay, as a stipend. So, I mean, that was part of a total package including tuition. So what I started off law school at was $262 a month, okay? My first rent for the apartment I got in South Central Los Angeles was approximately $65 a month. So I had a lot of money to spend on food and gasoline, okay, if you can believe that. By the way, my wife and I got married on the same amount. So there was money there. In any event, that's what it was. And quite frankly, the decision was relatively simple, although it took me a while. I had a relationship with my father at this point in my life. My father and I had approached him and we rekindled a relationship when I was 21. I was now 22 or 23. And I went to him and I said, you know, here's where I am. My mother's asked me to come to you to see what you think, and here are the choices. And he looked at me and he said, "Mijo, yo no te puedo ayudar." And I said, "That's fine, I understand that." And he says, "Well, in that case, if it were up to me, I would go to the place where I would have fewer worries. You're going to have a lot of worries, and it seems to me that USC is the place." I said, "But Dad, I don't want to go to California." Okay, end up in California, end up in law school. And I do well in law school, unlike the University of Texas suggested. That's still smoldering there, isn't it? So what I end up doing is clerking with California Rural Legal Assistance. And the man who hired me was Cruz Reynoso. Cruz was the director of CRLA. And I was one of 17 people they interviewed. And the reason I always keep numbers of where I am, primarily because that gives me a sense of what the likelihood is. So I interviewed, and he was actually looking for 7 clerks. So it was a good number mix. And at one point he said, "Te vas a ir a El Paso?" And I said, "Yeah, I got to go back to El Paso." And he said, "Okay. Well, it's kind of like." We're looking for people who can clerk for us, and if they're any good, we'd like to be able to hire them. But if you go to El Paso, I'm not sure you're a good fit. And I said, "Well, I want to go to El Paso." He hired me, and I ended up in Modesto, California, and had a great summer. I mean, literally a wonderful summer. Ended up with another gentleman from Stanford, who they also hired as a clerk, and it was tip-top. We did a whole bunch of things. It was the second time in my life I had a gun drawn on me. I had been sent to a farm labor camp to explain to farm workers what their rights were with respect to farm worker housing, water in the fields, and the like. And the lady who ran the camp pulled a gun on me and said, "Get off my property." I went back to the office a little skittish. And as it turns out, the sheriff and I rode out, and she, of course, denied that anything had happened. I could talk to the farm workers. And so I went out to talk to them. They had just come back from the fields a little earlier. And he looked at me and he said, "You tell them anything you want, but don't speak Spanish." And I said, "But they only understand Spanish." He says, "I have to understand you." So, "Yes, sir." So, les hablé Spanglish. Where one word is Spanish, one word is English. So he would get the drift of what I was talking about, but they would also get a sense of what was going on. I said that was the second time I had a gun drawn. The first time, Valerie Bannerman, remember, at Long Beach, had asked me to interview a lady for a divorce, which I did. And the next day her husband came looking for me. And so they called me out to the reception area, and he pulled a gun and he pointed at me and he says, "You're not going to give my wife a divorce." And I said, "I am not." And I wasn't lying because I wasn't a lawyer. So that happened a few times. In any event, I went to work for CRLA. I had a great time, enjoyed it immensely.
What were your other duties as clerk for Mr. Reynosa?
Oh, I did research. That was primarily what we were used for. We were used to do research for law in motion. You know, a lawyer would have a case and he'd say, "Look, you know, I need here's a draft of my pleading, but I need some more support for this argument, or can you find any authority for this?" And so we would go back and do research. Because I was bilingual, I was often taken out to the field by lawyers to talk to clients. The majority of clients were not English speaking, so you know that became part of my duties. Surveys, you know, how many cases, one kind or another, were handled by local lawyers. I would be asked to go meet local lawyers to establish some degree of rapport. At the time, CRLA wasn't liked. Not that it ever really has been, but at the time, the power structure in the Valley really hated CRLA.
And what does that stand for?
California Rural Legal Assistance, just like Texas Rural Legal Assistance in Texas. And so, and by the way, the governor of California had sought to shut it down, turned into a national fight, and ultimately California Rural Legal Assistance, Cruz, prevailed. And so part of the prevailing was an agreement that they would not represent the United Farm Workers. And Cesar and Cruz entered into an agreement that says we will not represent you on any union-related activities. This does not mean we will not represent your people in connection with any issues they may have separate and apart from the union. And that worked really well. I'll give you one story as an example. When they later hired me as a full-time lawyer, one of the first things I ended up doing was going to Livingston. Livingston is a little town south of Modesto. I ended up being hired to work out of the Modesto office as a lawyer, which we quickly moved to Ceres, which was the next little suburb. But
And that was after law school?
That was after law school. Okay. But we went down to Livingston to talk to the farm worker families, and we found out that one of the things that the Gallo family was doing, that was Gallo property, was evicting them, okay? Because the Gallo people had decided they were not going to negotiate with Cesar, and those were his farm workers, they were members of his union, so they were going to bring in others. So we initiated they initiated an eviction proceeding, and we went in and we told the court that it had no jurisdiction, that it was a wage dispute. And fortunately, we got the first judge to recuse himself, then got the second judge to take it under advisement, and we kept him in for almost 2 years. That didn't help the union, except for the fact that the union controlled who could access housing at the Livingston Gallo property, and Gallo couldn't. So he would have to bring in farm workers from other places to do the work, if he could find them, and that also became an issue over time. But that was one way that we weren't helping the union, we were helping the farm workers.
Was Spanish your first language?
Sí.
Okay, and
Born
then you
and
learned English in school?
In my household, both my parents knew English fluently. I would venture to suggest to you there was no accent on either case. My father, in his youth, in his early 30s, was a customs broker in El Paso, Juarez, and he had to speak English. My mother, again, was a sales clerk and ultimately manager of the hat shop at the White House department store. So she had to speak unaccented, fluent English, and they both were that way. So we were literally a bilingual household. My grandmother would make a point of making sure we were, porque me decía, habla español. I said, sí, abuela. So, you know, there was never any doubt about whether we were bilingual or not. The three of us, my brother, my sister, and I.
So were you able to meet Cesar Chavez?
Yes.
You personally? What was your
Yeah, I
interaction?
first met him in the context of that representation. he and Dolores and their lawyer, Cohen, came to one of the hearings that we had with the JP. And he was demonstrating his support for them. And we howdied. That was the first actual meeting that I had with him. I subsequently met with him on different occasions for different purposes. The work at CRLA resulted in a lot of good stuff for that community. Literally for the people in Modesto. Modesto at the time was 20,000 people. It's presently over 2 million. So it's not the same Modesto that it was then. It was very much controlled by the Gallo family. The second occasion when I met Cesar, there was a march on Gallo, and there's a woman who I had hired and was working for me there at Sierra Leone by the name of Linda Hanton, another Chicana with a last name that's Anglo. And Linda and I found housing for the farm workers. They arrived the day before the big march, and we created a banner for the march. I also provided that to Maggie. And Cesar came to greet the people in my home, and we howdied. It was a big event. I'm not sure how many thousand people were there, but there were several thousand people. So it was very, very impressive. The next time I saw him, he came to greet a group of people who were marching to the Capitol, La Marcha de la Reconquista, which was from Los Angeles all the way through the San Joaquin Valley up to Sacramento. And I was involved in that. I was a food procurer. They were coming to stop outside of Merced, and there were going to be 50 of them. They eventually grew into thousands, but there were going to be 50 of them marching the distance. And somebody found a farmer who had a pig. So one morning it was my job to go pick up the pig and take it to have it slaughtered and turned into carnitas. Nobody told me that I had to go wrestle the pig. I had to hog tie it. I had to toss him over a fence. I had to put him in the trunk of my car. And then I had to take him to the butcher who wasn't home in 104-degree weather. And so it was a day, and actually a month to speak of. It was a day to speak of because it was miserable. We got the pig there, it got roasted, and everybody ate. It was a month's effort because my car stunk for a month. And I used to drive it around with the trunk open and all the windows down for days. So there were various events that he kind of came into the setting, and I happened to be there. And the funny thing about it is I always thought that he no se acuerda de mí. I mean, the gentleman was dealing with thousands of people in all manners of setting. But it's funny, he did. After I left CRLA, and I'm kind of leaving some stuff out, but after I left CRLA, I was going to San Francisco because my wife was going to go to school of nursing. And I got a job in San Francisco working with a guy who ran San Francisco Neighborhood Legal Services. SNFLAF is what we called it. His name was Tom Mack. And on the occasion of my driving back to tell my wife I got a job, when I got home, I got a phone call and I was told, you need to go to this place. There's a gentleman waiting for you to talk to you. And it was kind of, but I have a job. I said, no, go to this place. And the gentleman who called was a gentleman by the name of Richard Baca, who was now running California Rural Legal Assistance. And so I ended up in San Francisco at 100 McAllister Street on the 15th floor in the offices of the Regional Director of the Community Services Administration. Community Services Administration was a successor to the Office of Economic Opportunity. And what he was looking for was a lawyer to become the regional counsel. And, well, stories associated with that, and at some point I may or may not tell you some, but the long and the short of it is I ended up taking that job. And in the course of that, started running into the same people who I had known in law school for various reasons. Before I get there, let me take one step back. The reason I could have gone any place in California when I was given the final offer to be a lawyer for CRLA, Actually, the place to go was my choice. But Michael Rice came to my home and he said, I understand you're going to take a job with CRLA. And I said, yes, I am. And he says, would you work with me? And I said, but you're here at the law school. He says, no, he says, I'm going to go run the Modesto office of CRLA. And I'll promise you one thing. I said, okay, what's that? He says, I'll teach you how to be a lawyer. He says, what you've learned in law school is how to think like one. There's a difference. And he says, and most people struggle the first 2 or 3 years learning how to be a lawyer. I will teach you how to be a lawyer. And he was a man of his word, okay? Everything from writing my first pleading to writing my first deposition to taking my first deposition. Real quick short story about that. I prepared a deposition in a case that I had filed against a property owner who had turned the water off of a woman who was on Social Security. He turned the water off because she was 1 month behind in her rent. Under California law, you cannot interfere with utilities. So I sued him. And he showed up with one of the better lawyers, better meaning well-to-do, better known, at his deposition in my law library, which is where we did it. So the deposition went well the first hour or so. Michael took me outside and he said, okay, you're there. You've narrowed it to a point where he can't say yes or no based on everything. He's got to tell you the truth. So I walked back in and I said, sir, you know, you said this to me, you said this to me, you said this to me. Yes, yes, yes. Did you shut her water off? And he stood up and he had a heart attack and he fell down. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later, took him away. I was in shock. I managed to get back to my office. Everybody in the office, the secretaries, the other lawyers were running around like chickens with their heads cut off, and I was just sitting there in shock. And then Michael walked in, and he sat down, and he said, that was an excellent job. You killed him, man. You killed him. He didn't die, okay? He survived. And the next day, his lawyer settled the case, gave my client what she was due under the statute, and a year's free rent. Okay.
So what would you say your main focus on practicing law has been? I mean, it seems to be towing a lot of it. What would be, I guess, the cases you're most drawn to?
The world is a funny place. There's everything in it. I did the basic legal services kinds of activities when I was at CRLA. When I went to work for CSA, I initially was doing grant review, which means I was looking to make sure that the grants we were making comported with the requirements of federal statute. Unbeknownst to me, over a period of about 2 years, I actually became a national expert on grant law. I didn't know it because there was nobody to talk to about it. But the reason I knew I was is because the Carter administration came in and they appointed a new general counsel of the agency, and he and I got into a disagreement. His name was Frank Jones. Frank and I didn't hit it off because Frank said very pointedly, you know, how can I help you? And having dealt with a prior general counsel who was not interested in helping but was interested more in stopping the delivery of grant monies to poor people, I told him, just leave me alone. You know, I work better by myself. He took that as arrogance, and it probably was. And so, you know, at one point I told my wife after that trip, I'm probably going to be asked to leave here. I was not concerned about that, but that was in fact what I expected. Approximately 2 months later, I got a phone call from his secretary asking me to meet him at the Jack Tar Hotel in San Francisco that evening. It was after dinner. It was 6 o'clock. My dinner's normally 5:30. So I was there at the Jack Tar, my wife waiting with dinner at home. And at 7, he hadn't shown up. So I started to walk out of the hotel, and he walks up the steps, and he says, you, follow me. And so, okay. We walk in, we sit down. Long story short, 3 martinis in his stomach later. I didn't have anything to drink. And Frank, if you watch this, that really did happen. He told me, I've talked to everybody, because I used to be hired out by the other regional offices to go fix problems. He says, I've talked to these other regional directors and I'm satisfied. I'm here to offer you the job as the special counsel in charge of all the regions in the country. I need you to come to Washington. And I'm going, huh? I'm supposed to get fired. I'm not supposed to be. So I said no. I turned him down. Long negotiation later, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I meet Graciela Olivares. She's now the director of CSA. One of the most outstanding human beings I've ever had the pleasure to meet. Like my mother, she was down to earth. A strong woman, because she knew literally how men looked upon her as being their boss. And boy, she knew how to manage those men. And to my good fortune, she was...
Yeah, we can wrap some up. We had some problems with the camera earlier. Yeah, we'll okay, thank you. Okay, well, we'll be wrapping up here soon. And if, you know what, and I'm thinking too, I mean, because we just hit it, you're barely in law school, you know, so what we can do is continue, you know, if we want to, plus it'll give you a chance to, you know, have a rest, and then we'll get to like the second half of your life. Maybe we can try again for next week as well.
That's fine.
Yeah, it can be kind of a two-part type thing, if that's, you know, if that
Got
would
to tell you how we got together with Cesar, thanks to Graciela, and did some things. Oh, there's a ton of stuff, much of which I've skipped, interestingly enough, just to move along. But the reality is, it's been an interesting life.
Well, I mean, there's so much more that I want to, you know, pick your brain about. So if we can, you know, we'll stop recording here.